If you look at the ongoing wars in the world today, you will find a question echoing in the minds of many. Why are there leaders willing to take extreme risks, even knowing full well there will be a massive loss of human life, yet still decide to push forward? Behind those decisions, aside from economic, geopolitical, and national interest factors, lies a psychological layer that is deeply worth analyzing. In political psychology, this is often referred to as the dark triad. The dark triad is not a label used to condemn someone, but rather a model describing three clusters of personality traits that tend to go together: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. When these traits appear at a high level in an individual holding immense power, their impact no longer stops at a personal level. It can affect the destiny of an entire nation. The first element is narcissism. At a mild level, narcissism gives a person confidence, ambition, and the desire to leave a mark. But when it inflates excessively, that person begins to believe they have a special historical mission. They don't just want to lead effectively, they want to be written into the history books as a king, a hero, a figure who changed the global landscape. When the ego is tightly bound to that image of greatness, every decision is governed by the question, will this make me great? Instead of, is this what's best for the people? In that state, opposition is easily interpreted as a personal insult. An economic sanction might be felt as a humiliation. International criticism could be seen as a challenge to their honor. And when personal honor is tied to national honor, the line between the common good and the individual ego becomes blurred. At that point, the decision to escalate a conflict is sometimes no longer purely strategic, but a reaction to protect their own self-image. The second element is Machiavellianism. This is the tendency to view the world as a chessboard, where people and nations are merely pieces to be arranged. A person with this trait is usually very good at long-term calculation, extremely calm, and pragmatic. They believe that the end justifies the means. If they have to sacrifice a part to achieve a larger strategic goal, they are willing to do it. In that mindset, emotions and morals are not the center. Efficiency and power are. It is worth noting that Machiavellianism doesn't necessarily manifest as hot-headedness. On the contrary, it often comes with a calm exterior, high self-control, and tight speech. But inside is a system of continuous calculation. If I take this step, how will the opponent react? How will the market fluctuate? How will allies pivot? In the context of war, this mindset can lead to decisions made very coldly, completely detached from the emotions of the families who will be affected. The third element is psychopathy, understood here as a personality trait rather than a clinical diagnosis. This trait involves a low level of empathy, feeling little guilt, and rarely being tormented by the tragic consequences they cause. When a person doesn't deeply feel the pain of others, they can make decisions that cause massive casualties and still sleep soundly. This is especially dangerous when combined with absolute power and modern weaponry. When these three elements intersect the grandiose ego, the cold chessboard mindset, and the lack of empathy, they create a psychological configuration capable of accepting extremely high risks. For an ordinary person, the thought of thousands of broken families is enough to make them step back. But with a strong dark triad configuration, the focus remains fixated on legacy, power, and strategic victory. However, we need to look at the issue with balance. Not every hardline leader belongs to the dark triad. International politics is inherently a fiercely competitive environment where difficult decisions are unavoidable. There are times when a nation is forced to act to defend itself or protect its vital interests. The key is to distinguish between a decision based on calculated mutual security and a decision driven by an inflated ego or a lack of empathy. Another point worth pondering is that political systems and cultures of power can either amplify or restrain these traits. In places with strong checks and balances, an independent press, and an active civil society, impulsive or overly risky decisions are hard to pass. Conversely, when power is concentrated in one individual or a small group, personal personality traits will have a vastly greater influence on the fate of the nation. On a personal level, understanding the dark triad isn't just for analyzing leaders, but also for reflecting on ourselves. Because within everyone, there are seeds of narcissism, calculation, and callousness in certain situations. When you feel you are absolutely right, When you treat others merely as tools, when you are indifferent to a pain that doesn't touch you directly, that is when tiny fragments of the triad appear. The difference lies in the degree and whether we consciously choose to adjust them. War is never just a story of weapons or borders. It is also a story of the psychology of power. When the personal ego merges with national power, when the strategic chessboard overshadows human value, and when empathy diminishes, the risk of escalating conflict rises sharply. Therefore, understanding the dark triad gives us a lens to read the news more soberly. Instead of just looking at the surface of political statements, we can ask ourselves, is this decision being driven by fear, by personal honor, by power calculations, or by the need to protect human lives? That question isn't easy to answer, but it keeps us from being completely swept away by empty slogans. Ultimately, in a volatile world, what each person can do is cultivate the exact opposite of the dark triad. Humility instead of narcissism, ethics instead of pure Machiavellian calculation, and empathy instead of callousness. Because if power is guided by a sense of responsibility and an understanding of human value, the risk of cold decisions causing massive devastation will be significantly reduced. And that is perhaps the most realistic hope in our current context.